Relatively new ham. I joined in to my great fortune, with a group of other young hams, all high school and eventually college age, with a club called the West Valley Amateur Radio Club. And we were out it's the West San Fernando Valley, nothing to do with the one in Arizona. And it was all kids, no adults, but we were very big on contesting, and of course, kind of going along with that with some DXing. Many of those members today are in the CQ Contest Hall of Fame. It was a wonderful start for a young ham. And of course, we entered the CQ and ARRL DX contests. But when you do enough of that, you start to realize that you're not at a great advantage being just another W6. And you start to wonder, what might it be like on the other side of these DX pileups? Well, time and resources eventually combined to allow me to answer that question for myself. I started doing some operations overseas. And in each case, the adventure was a little different. And there's some commonalities, some things you have to prepare for, but there are also some unique things. In this case, we had various hosts and various host countries. Let me share my slides and we can start talking a little bit about this. Okay, is the slide showing okay for you?
Yes.
All right, away we go. This talk has actually two subtitles. Those who are familiar with contesting may have heard K3LR. That's Tim Duffy. Tim is also the president of DX Engineering, and he hosts one of the largest and most capable multi-operator stations in the US, and routinely is the top, or at least one of the top stations in multi-operator contesting in the US. And it's a very formidable station, and to come anywhere close to his score is a considerable achievement, the score of his team, I should say. For those who are not familiar with radio contesting, usually it involves a fixed period of time, a defined set of eligible contacts. In some cases, it's just within the US and Canada. Other times it's outside the US. The outside the US ones are called DX contests. And these scores are based on how many different contacts you make. You get points depending on whether it's on your continent but outside your country, or if it's on a different continent, different values for those. And we typically use 6 HF bands, 160 meters, 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10 meters. There are multipliers in these contests. In the case of ARRL sweepstakes, for example, it would be sections, ARRL sections and Canadian sections. In the ARRL DX contest, it's countries. In the CQ worldwide contest, which is, I think, the largest in the world in terms of participation. In fact, it may be the largest participation sport anywhere in the world. It is a combination of countries worked per band and zones worked per band. Zones are, it's an artificial division came up back in the 1940s from CQ magazine publisher for their Worked All Zones award. They divided the world into 40 different zones. Some of them are very populated, like Zone 3, which is the Western US, Zone 5, which is the Eastern US. Some are very lonely, like Zone 23, which is Mongolia and a couple of little chunks of Russia and China. So the value of a contact to somebody here in the United States, for example, which is, say, South Africa, it's Zone 38. If that's the first one you work on that band, you get credit for the zone, credit for the country. So clearly there's a much more demand to try and reach that station and contact them than it would, say, to reach a Canadian, where they're fairly easy for us to work. The pessimist subtitle for this is How to Win Last Place in Africa. And we'll explain that a little bit later. As I mentioned, I started going around various places to operate CQ Worldwide Contest. At this point, I've done 23 different countries. And you can see them indicated there. The one we're going to be talking about is here in yellow. Here's a tabular presentation, and you can see Hawaii, Mexico, French Guiana, Jordan, US Virgin Islands, Galapagos, Alaska, Brazil, Morocco, back to Hawaii again, where I actually lived for 4 years, the Gambia, Jamaica, Australia, Honduras, Isle of Jersey, Qatar, South Cook Islands, Philippines, Croatia, Azores, Mauritius, which is where we're talking about today, Japan, and South Africa. We've had a very varied success. Some of these I operated, just a few of them I was single op. Most of them we were multi-operator. Now, the CQ Worldwide Contest has a number of entry categories. The big daddy category, if you will, is multi-operator, multi-transmitter, multi-multi. And in other words, you have basically as many of the 6 bands as you can put on at once, you can work at once. The fact that one person's making a contact on band A means no restriction on somebody else making a contact on band B. All the other categories have some limits on how many transmitters you can have going at any one time, and so on. So we've had a fair amount of success. You see there are 3 world first places in our category. We've had a couple of continental winners, several records for the countries we were operating from, a couple of de-expeditions of the year as voted by the CQ staff. And I'll tell you, these things are an awful lot of fun. You find out a lot. You have to do a lot of preparation. And I will tell you that even though a lot of my activity these days is in public service communication, the things you learn operating at a remote location come very much into play when you're operating in a potentially disaster environment or out in the field. And so everything you do in ham radio, in my opinion, contributes to everything else you do in ham radio. So there's several ways to do these expeditions. The easiest way is to become a guest operator at an existing station. My first trial, I was out in Hawaii back when Randy Soul, KH6XX, owned a place up on the north shore of Oahu, which later I ended up becoming my home while I was assigned there. And at 9A1A in Croatia, where we went, and we didn't have to put up antennas because they had enough. And this doesn't even show all the beverages they had going in about 10 different directions. They had stations, amplifiers, bandpass filters, switching arrangements all set up. Pretty much all I had to bring was my headphones. There's a somewhat harder way, and that is where you find an existing station and you supplement it with bringing things, radios, additional amplifiers, maybe a couple of antennas, and you take a station that wasn't designed for multi-transmitter operation and you turn it into one that is, at least for the weekend. And you see we've had a few of those. This was on the Azores. This was the radio club building, and we took this little long-term hotel stay thing and commandeered a couple of the rooms, put up some more antennas. We actually ran Cat5 cable between the 2 buildings so that over the road, so that we could connect the computers and have our logging computers all synchronized. Then there's the hard way. Now, not the hardest way. The hardest way is where you charter an icebreaker and you bounce around on the ocean for a week. That's not for us. That's certainly not for me. But the hard way is basically you're starting with bare dirt and you have to bring everything. In some cases, there are locals there, and we always try to cooperate with the locals and work with them. And if there aren't any, then you're kind of on your own. And there have been a couple of those as well. But you can see the majority of these, we went where there was nothing and built it all and made it happen. A 3B8M was one of those situations. Now, bringing everything poses some challenges. There are a couple of things in the world that have gone extinct, and this one is particularly appropriate. You may recognize that as the dodo bird. Dodo bird's flightless bird exists only, or existed only, on the island of Mauritius. And as when British and other sailors discovered the island and discovered the birds, they were easy pickings because they couldn't fly, and they hunted them for food and hunted them to extinction, and that was the end of the dodo. The other thing that seems to be have gone away is 70-pound airline bags. We used to haul alpha transformers in one bag and the amplifier and tubes in another, and radios and antennas. We got away with all sorts of stuff. I remember going to down to Ecuador, or down to Galapagos via Ecuador, and we had to rewire a station in order to be able to run all the transmitters. So we had big rolls of Romex duct tape to the outside of our suitcases. Imagine how that would go over with TSA today. We took, in the case of French Guiana, we had an antenna boom that was too long to go in the cargo hold. They let us bring it on board and lay it in the aisle next to all the seats. Imagine being able to do that today. So our constraints are more considerable than they were. Now, whenever you're going to go on a trip like this, you have to think of several things. First, of course, is to make sure you have licenses for all operators. And that could take up to 6 months or more. We didn't have that much time in this case. My license actually came from the ministry 3 days before the contest started, but we got it done. You'll need customs clearance for your gear, and sometimes that means there are prohibited items that you can't bring in. And went to the Philippines, we couldn't bring in transmitters. Well, that kind of screwed us up for multi-transmitter operation. Fortunately, our host was college friends with the guy who heads their FCC, their equivalent of the FCC. And he approached him, caught him in town and said, hey, can we get some approvals for these? So we got approvals and we could bring our gear in. But you have to think about all that ahead of time. And sometimes that means reading the fine print. You have to think about the power sources, what voltages, and make sure you have the required plugs or adapters. Sometimes you can get those locally, but again, be prepared. Make sure your equipment is all working, get it packed for transport. Not everything can be carry-on. Fortunately, my Elecraft K3, which is the transceiver I take with me, is only 8 pounds and fairly compact, so it can go in a hand carry-on, and I don't have to worry about baggage handlers doing bad things to it. Prior to that, it was a TS 930 Kenwood, and that was quite a bit heavier, but we still generally tried to make it hand baggage because we didn't want it, thrown around. You have to deal with any tools, repair parts, cables, accessories. You have to prepare to work in the local climate. Sometimes that means very hot. Sometimes that means rather cold. In this case, it was very moderate and very easy. So that was probably the easiest of those that we had to deal with. This trip started with Olaf Lundberg, G0CKV, who's by the name you can tell he's Swedish, but he spent most of his time in the UK doing business, and so he has a UK license. Olaf started a little company you may have heard called Inmarsat, and grew it, and then became CEO of another major satellite company. So he's done a lot of travel, and he was putting together a team to go to Mauritius for the CQ Worldwide CW contest in 2019. This is all just before the pandemic hit. And he was going to do what they call a multi-single, which means only one run transmitter on at a time. And he had several other Gs and so on. And he had invited our director, Dick Norton, N6AA in the Southwestern Division, and his predecessor, Art Goddard, W6XD, now Silent Key, sadly. And they were planning on doing a multi-single operation. Well, one by one, the other G operators fell out and they were starting to run low on people. And so I got an invitation to join them, which I did. I was very happy that invitation. And we said, look, even though we don't have 6 rigs and, positions to run all at the same time, let's go multi anyway, because when you go multi-single, you leave a lot of contacts on the table. And if we're going to all this trouble, we might as well hand out as many contacts as we can and be on the air as much as we can. So even though we're less competitive than the stations where they have 6 dedicated stations, 6 dedicated bands with maybe 1 or 2 transmitters per band and multiple operators and so on, we said this is still the best way to go. It's the best way to take advantage of this rare location and make this rare contact available for as many people as possible. So one of the things we had to deal with were antennas. Olaf dealt with the 160, 80, and 40 meter antennas, and it fell to me to take care of the 20, 15, and 10 meter antennas. I had built a full set of vertical dipoles for these bands, and I very carefully weighed everything on a triple beam scale that I have that weighs down to the gram. And I knew what everything weighed. I was able to get all 3 antennas into one of these SKB golf club cases. This is just a high density polyethylene. It's got wheels on the bottom. It's got handles all over the place. Very convenient. And they're 4 feet long inside, which means we cut all our antennas so that they would fit in the 4 foot length. So just under the 50-pound limit. So that was good. And you say, but boy, that's a long case. Don't you have a dimensional penalty to pay? Yeah, normally you would. But the airlines generally make exception for sporting equipment. Well, of course, this is sporting equipment. It's radio sporting equipment, and it fits in a case that looks like golf clubs. So we didn't have to worry about paying for that. So where are we going? Okay, here we are on the east coast of Africa. This big island here, Madagascar. And there are a couple of others along here that are rare for us on the West Coast. But here's Reunion. There's Mauritius. Out here off Mauritius is Rodriguez Island, which recently, within the last few years, was officially recognized as belonging to the government of Mauritius. So we're on the west end of the Indian Ocean, looking across all this water at VK6 over here in Zone 29. Zone 39, which is where we were operating, is only this batch of islands. Nothing on a continental. And so as you see, there aren't many places that people could operate and hand that zone out. So it is rare, which is good for us because everybody's going to try extra hard to make contacts with us. Now, because it's a long way away, it's almost right on the antipodes of where we are. At the other side of the world, it takes a long time to get there. It's about 12,000 miles away. So we had a long flight from LA to Charles de Gaulle Airport. And then I had another long flight from Charles de Gaulle Airport to Mauritius. Each one was about 12 hours long. And in between, I had a 12-hour layover at de Gaulle Airport. So I was pretty beat by the time we got there. On the way, I've been reading about row clouds, and I looked out the window over East Africa, and son of a gun, look at all those row clouds all the way as far as you could see. I thought that was pretty cool. So here we land. The airport is here on this red arrow in the southeast end of the island. Where we were operating is Rochers Noir, or Black Rock, up here on the northeast section. It's about about an hour and a half drive, even though it doesn't look like it's that far. In this area of Roche Noire, there's this little jetty that is made on a little man-made island. And there's a house there that's very robustly built. And that was going to be our operating position. Now, for the vertical dipoles that I made, that's really good because you've got salt water right all around you, which is kind of what these things need to operate well. Here's a Great Circle map. I run one of these. There's a group in Arizona that does these. You know, you can go online and specify what you want, and you can get these maps printed on your computer. This basically shows where you are, and then everything else in a relative compass direction from there, and with relative distance. The other side of the world being at the far end of the circles here. So you can see the U.S. is very, very far away from us. Japan over here, Europe up here. Now, I've operated from Africa several times before. We mentioned Morocco up here and the Gambia right over here. And in both those cases, it's a really short hop to Europe, and it's right across the pond to the US. So they are very, very favored. So when I said we win 4th place in Africa, that's because it's a very different contest from way out here than it is from up there close into all those contact places. So we arrived and we started unpacking. This is a big covered patio area, and a very nice one. You'll see more of that later. This was going to be our operating position here, and then also where we had our meals and so on. You can see outside there some aluminum on the table. Those are parts of the 20, 15, and 10 meter 2-element vertical dipole arrays that I had brought. I started assembling them pretty quickly, and by the next day I had those 2 of those bands up and the 3rd one ready to go up as soon as we had some additional hands on deck. For the first day or 2, it was only Olaf and me and one of his local friends. These black tubes are the low band antennas that Olaf brought. They are very long collapsible fiberglass poles made by Spider Beam, and he carries them not in golf club cases because they're too long for that. He brings them in ski cases, ski bags, and he was able to get that all in again with his luggage limits. So this is how we set these things up. One goes as close to the water as you can get it. The other one, a specified distance behind it, depending on the band. And I brought some PVC drain pipe, and we wound chokes all around the coax to try and keep the RF off the outside of the coax as it came into the operating position. This is 15 meters right here. 20 meters is there in the background. You'll get a better picture of that in a minute. Said we needed more people than just Olaf and me to put the 20s up. The poles at the bottom are separated from the actual antenna by an insulator. And remember, these are dipoles, so high voltage on both ends. And then these arms are basically loading arms so that this thing doesn't have to be 33 feet tall. This is low tide, obviously, but it doesn't get much worse at high tide. So we kind of laid out the guys with rocks or stakes or whatever we could. They're not very heavy, so we were able to hold them up and then run the coax back to where the operating position is. Here's the 10 meter. I put this up myself. It didn't take long at all. And each of those sticks is only about 16 feet altogether, 15 feet. And again, the little choke, and run the cable back to the operating position. Here's one of the verticals. This is the 40 meter. Olaf and I put this up. These Spider Beam poles are very well made. They're made so that you could actually extend them and then tilt them up. we didn't do it that way. We stood on rocks and whatever we could and pushed them up one section at a time, and then put on a little locking clamp so it wouldn't slip back down. And then we went to the next one and the next one. There's a wire running all the way up here, and then a bit of a top hat that goes off to a tree. And there's a loading system in the base. This was a 12-meter mast for 40 meters. He had 17-meter masts for the lower bands. They're 80 and 160. You can see the top loading is kind of pulling it over a little bit, but they went up without too much trouble, and they stayed up. This is that causeway that goes out to this little island. So we got a chance to do some operation after the antennas were up. We try to do that early so that we can start checking propagation and seeing how the antennas work, and B, check for interstation interference and try and resolve any issues that might affect us before the contest starts. So I was on 80 meters, and everything was CW on this. It was a CW contest. None of us brought microphones. All our contacts during the whole week were CW. Before the contest, I was using my newly acquired call sign of N6VI/3B8. Sorry, 3B8/N6VI, I should say. And managed to work some folks over on the West Coast, some friends of mine in Southern California, which was great. It was just our sunset. It was just their sunrise. And for those of you who do low band DXing, you know that what they call the gray line provides enhanced propagation for people on either side of that curve. And somebody said, well, did you work them long path or short path? And I said, what's the difference? It's 12,000 miles. No, one's just as long as the other. And of course we were going around this way, because that's where the dark is, and that's where 40 meters or 80 meters wants to be. Looking from near that table I showed you earlier, this is the rest of this covered area. You see how nicely this is done. This whole building is made with walls that are like solid concrete, reinforced concrete, 2 feet thick. These shutters are all remote controllable with a little dongle. You can raise them up or down as far as you want. So if it gets rainy or windy, you can just lower them down, then raise them up again. The place is very nicely done. One of the nice features of this is rental of this place comes along with the services of 2 local ladies who cook 2 meals a day. They cook a big lunch and a big breakfast, actually, and then a big lunch mid-afternoon. And then we usually have more than enough leftovers for dinner if we're still hungry. They also clean every day. They do the beds, they sweep up, and of course we're tracking sand in and out here as we are putting antennas up and testing things and hauling things back and forth. So that was probably a little extra work for them, but they kept it really nice for us. This is usually the area where we'd have our breakfast in the morning. Very pleasant, as you can see. So this is our host, Olaf, G0CKV. Olaf loves the low bands in particular, and he spent most of his time on 80 and 160 meters. We just had 3 stations with amplifiers. I brought 2 of the amplifiers, and Olaf brought 1. And then we had 1 additional station with a radio, but no amplifier. So the layout was, we had this station was 80 and 160. We had to switch back and forth, and that meant switching the stub filters and the receive bandpass filters and so on. A little cumbersome, but it worked okay. Another station was 20 meters only, because it was open pretty much 24 hours a day. And a third station with an amplifier was the 40 and 15 meter station. So when 15 started to close down or get slow, we'd change all the cabling and hook up 40 meters, and we'd be off and running on 40, and that would take us through the night. And then when that slowed down, you get back on 15. And then the 4th station was kind of a floater. We mainly left it on 10 meters to look for mults. We didn't have a big signal, but we did work some stuff, as you'll see. So I spent time, I relieved Dick on 20 quite a bit. I relieved Olaf on 80 and 160, and then I also hung around on 10 meters trying to pick up stuff there. Here's one of our secret weapons. You may recognize Dave Sumner, former CEO of ARRL, K1ZZ. Dave happened to be in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt for an IARU meeting, the International Amateur Radio Union. And we convinced him to, instead of flying home, he was already more than halfway there. Just come on down and join us in Mauritius, which he did a couple of days before the contest started. Those of you who know Dave know that he is an outstanding contest operator, in particular, an outstanding CW operator. And he was really one of our secret weapons on 40 and 15. He knows so many hams around the world. He's done so much contesting and so much DXing that even with the lightning crashes that we had, and they were frequent between the lightning storms in Indonesia area to our east and in Central Africa to our west, often we get crashes that wiped out parts of dits and DAWs or letters or even parts of whole call signs. Dave could get a partial and figure out who he thinks it was and be right about 99% of the time. So he was a great contributor to the operation and the scoring. These boxes here you see are bandpass filters, and they're not made for a kilowatt, but they will handle the power of a transceiver, and that allowed us to further isolate the signals from one band versus the signals of another. So when one person's transmitting, you don't hear their signal. You might hear a little bit if you're on a direct harmonic, but it's greatly attenuated. These things work very, very well. And then on the transmitter outputs, we have stub filters, and the stub filters are basically, in its essence, the simplest one is a quarter wavelength shorted, which is pretty much invisible at the operating frequency, but at even harmonics, it's an attenuator, and so that helps further suppress any out of band signals that might cause trouble for us. Here's the late Art Goddard, W6XD. I've been with, I don't know how many expeditions, easily over a dozen with Art over the years. Art as an engineer used to work for Rockwell Collins, and he would diagnose problems and fix things, and as well as operating, he was great at diagnosing and solving mechanical and electrical problems. Down here we have Denny KX7M from Northern California. Denny is in the IT business, and he was very instrumental in resolving what turned out to be our biggest issue, and that is not interference between stations, but interference between stations and computers. In most of these operations, each of us is in a different room. We're fairly physically separated, different hotel rooms or different rooms in a building. Well, here we're all kind of congregated together. When it's CW, you don't have to worry about somebody else's voice, bleeding into your headphones. So it's quiet in that regard. But with all these computers and all the amplifiers, somebody transmits and somebody else's computer goes blank. Well, you can't have that. So Denny spent probably at least a day and a half armed with his knowledge and Olaf's ample supply of ferrites, and he kept going until every one of those problems was solved, and that was at least as important as any interstation interference matters. So again, great contribution on his part. And there's Dick N6AA at the 20-meter position. He was using my little HL550 amp. It's Tokyo High Power Labs. It's only about 21, 22 pounds, so pretty light, and puts out about 700 or 800 watts. So that was perfect. And I was just at the 10-meter in this case, looking for some additional signals and trying to work a few folks as best we could. So here's the final result. As you might imagine, our best band was 15 meters and almost 3,000 contacts, 33 zones, 129 countries. The next best was 40 meters. So the Dave and Art team really piled the contacts on 2,338 zones, almost a sweep, and 122 countries. Then 20 meters, over 2,000 contacts, 37 zones, 133 countries. Even 10 meters where we had no amplifier, made several hundred contacts, 19 zones, 53 countries. And from way down there, I think that was pretty good. We were pretty happy with that. Over 100 contacts on 160 in 40 different countries and 16 different zones, and then 80, just about 1,000 contacts. That's about as well as we've done anywhere in my experience. I was the 80-meter operator at in Qatar, Alpha 73 Alpha, and made just under 1,000 contacts. So that's, and again, that was, you know, a fair distance from the contact centers of Europe and North America. So we figure that's a pretty good score. 32 zones in almost 100 countries. So the final score of 19 million, that put us just ahead of Tim K3LR and his team. So even though it's not a fair comparison, we thought it was cool anyway. So that's the story. Why don't we see if there are some questions, and I will stop the share.
For sharing. Looking for hands up or things in the chat.
While we're waiting for hands, I see we've been joined by Kimo Chung, KH7U. Kimo was a good friend I met when I was living and working in Hawaii. He helped a lot at our station, participated in the multis there, and he was very instrumental in a lot of the expeditions going out to other parts of the Pacific. So aloha, Kimo. Nice to have you with us.
Same here, Marty. Good to hear you, and hello to all. I was also fortunate to go to 3B9R back around '98, so I'm well aware of all the trials and tribulations from operating that area, Marty. Over.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, yeah, that was way earlier, and probably there were even further difficulties. You know, Olaf used to operate from there. He's been out to Rodriguez as well, which is even more restrictive in terms of what you can bring along. But he had and his wife had stayed at this particular place on vacation, and he started thinking, well, why don't we use it for the radio site? And it turned out to be a great decision. So I know you didn't have that kind of luxury when you were out there, but this really makes it nice. Okay, we've got a question from Gene, N3XUS.
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir, go ahead.
Okay, I was just wondering what kind of process did you have to go through to get reciprocal licensing so that you could operate in that area?
Okay, good question. How do we get the license? It varies from place to place. If you're going to like one of the CEPT countries in Europe, all you really have to do is bring your license and a copy of the CEPT agreement. And of course, to get the general HF privileges in those CEPT countries, you have to have an extra class license. That was no problem in this case. In the case of Mauritius, it's a separate license issued by the government. There's a fairly lengthy application and a fee, and you send in copies of your license, your passport. In this case, you also have to tell them what kind of equipment you're bringing, what the power outputs are, and all sorts of other details. So we sent all that off, and then we wait and we wait. And it wasn't until we got on the island and were a few days in that they called and said the license was ready.
Now, is that through the government of France or on the own municipality of that island?
No, it's not a municipality. It's its own country. It's a sovereign country, and they have a Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs that regulates radio, just like we have the FCC in the United States. So that is their national licensing authority.
All right, well, thank you very much. That's great information.
Absolutely.
Well, I have a quick question.
Go ahead, Dan.
And that is this mostly a male deal, or is there females involved with this stuff too?
We've only had male operators in our group. There are expeditions that have female operators. Back in my earlier days, my wife would come with me, and several other of my ham friends' wives would come along. And in fact, my wife got to, this is before she was licensed, way before she was licensed. She would even help, haul antennas out to the beach, and somebody says, "Oh, I need a screwdriver," and she'd say, "Straight or Phillips?" She said, "How do you know the difference?" She said, "Because I've done this before." And she got particularly good at helping pack up, because she knew that as soon as we packed everything up, we could actually go do some sightseeing. We didn't usually risk taking the time until we had all the bugs worked out before the contest, but afterward there was a chance to go around and see some things. But the wives came on a number of these trips. There are others, of course, going to the Middle East where you don't bring your wives because nobody brings their wives and you don't get to meet families and so on. It's just, that's the culture. And on a trip like this, my wife was not up for a 36-hour flights and waiting around airports. But the core group really has been around Dick Norton, Art Goddard, myself, Phil Getz, N6ZZ before he passed away, and a number of other fellows who join us on a fairly regular basis.
I see Dan's got his hand up.
Hi, Dan.
Yeah. Hey, Marty. Two questions. First of all, can you say more about the chokes that you had on the coax leading to the feed points on your verticals? And the other one is looking at that table with all those emitters and laptops reminded me of the day when in the Park Service, I could just surreptitiously key up my 5-watt radio on my belt and reboot any of the 1980s desktop computers in the Park Service.
And that's probably when they had more metal on them than they do these days.
Oh yeah, regular old IBM PCs.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about what you made those. Well, first of all, I want to know what mix was used to stop the interference on that close community of emitters and receivers in the form of the laptops.
Okay. I don't know the mix, but I'm guessing it's probably mix 31. That's probably the most effective over the broadest range, and pretty much what everybody uses these days. Now, in past trips with those verticals, I had made a set of the chokes that were designed by K9YC, Jim Brown. I'm sure you know Jim. He's an audio engineer who has done a lot of noise suppression research and benefited ham radio as a result of doing all the experimenting he did. But this would be like 6 or 7 big toroids on a plate, and we'd have multiple turns going through them. But those are all really heavy. You start getting 6 or 7 per band. That adds a lot of weight that we just didn't have room for. So going to the next best alternative, I used the 4-inch drain pipe, which is about 4 1/4 OD, and then wound a specific number of turns. 40 meters would be like 12 turns of coax, 20 meters would be 6, 15 would be 4 turns, 10 would be 3 turns, and that seemed to do the trick.
All right, I've been making do with 5 of Palomar's 2.4-inch toroids taped together, and then as many turns of LMR 400 as I can fit through.
Okay, there's been some updates to that. If you go to Jim Brown K9YC's website, he has come up with some new. He's done a lot of research, and he's found that you can accomplish the same thing with single core toroids, either 1 or 2, depending on how much power you have to dissipate. and specific windings for specific bands. It's typically like 16 or say for 15 meters, you have like 15 or 16 turns we use RG 400 because it's high power and yet it's flexible and small diameter around these things. And then you can then attach it to the antenna and the coax as you see fit. And he has several examples of how to do that. The problem with the LMR is that it's a foam dielectric, and I'm sure the minimum bend radius published is more on the order of 6 to 12 inches. And here you're running these things really tight. And of course, in a hot environment, there's a possibility that the center conductor, which it can be stiff, it can push up against the foam and deform in heat. And so just like you don't want to use that in a mobile installation, we didn't want to use it for this sort of thing. Jim has another set of designs, same concept exactly, but instead he's using, I think, number 14 Teflon covered stranded wire. And he uses 2 different colors so as not to get them mixed up. Same kind of thing. You wind them tight, and then he's found that, you put one of those actually will handle a kilowatt on most bands, assuming the match is good. If you really want some extra margin, you put a second one right below it. You don't want to stack the cores because that changes the impedance and now it changes the band that it covers. So follow his cookbook and you'll have success with that, and you'll have most of those cores left over to do other antennas.
I will look at that site, but the minimum bend radius on LMR 400 specification is 4 inches, which I'm not gonna. You can't bend it. You can't make multiple passes through a toroid.
No, you couldn't.
That's
So that's why I'm saying you use something like either use the Teflon wire method or use RG 400, which it's like RG 142, but it's got a stranded center instead of a solid center. And it's Teflon dielectric. It's good for like 5 kilowatts on HF, so you don't have to worry about that.
I don't have to worry about anything more than 100 watts.
Okay, you could make it out of RG RG 58 or RG 8X then.
Well, I'm stuck in my ways, and I'm not putting anything 100 or 80 feet up that's not attached to LMR 400.
Okay.
Hey, and
Anyway.
now it actually helps the cable from flopping around because you get the weight of 5 toroids and 4 or 5 passes.
Yeah.
And the first one I did was like 12 or 13 inches diameter. So the bend radius
And if
was
you're hanging it from the ends, you get a non-inverted V.
no, and actually what I think what I'm going to do next is an inverted V with one of those.
Just suspend it from the center.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway,
and
you can't get away.
The first one worked for me, and I'm nowhere near understanding all of that science, although I will look at this website.
The other place to look for that is W8JI's website. He's got some good stuff on chokes. I think that's where I got the info for the simple around the pipe chokes that I wound. They're not as effective as the
Marty, I need 1 or 2 more antennas on the tower here, and then I'm done building antennas for the second time in my life, and probably the last time. We're at opposite ends of the spectrum there. But it's interesting, and thank you for upping my educational goals.
Oh, no problem at all. I mean, all these are great people who shared their information with me, so might as well pass it on. Other questions or comments? Anything in chat, Barry?
Someone just wait a minute. Is it all Elecraft KM3s? All K3s?
Yes, they were all Elecraft K3s. I think one was a K3S, and I had upgraded the synthesizer in mind to the same one as in the K3S, just to keep the signal as clean as possible. We talked about this in the field day talk it's archived on the RATPAC site, but the choice of radio when you have multiple radios in close proximity with one another, the choice of radio can make a big difference on how much or little interstation interference you have. It needs A, to be clean on the transmit side, and B, it needs to be robust on the receive side, you know, ability to handle strong signals that are adjacent but not right on top of you. And the K3 shows very well in both of those categories. And that, combined with its small form factor, lightweight, and ease of operation, made it a really good choice, and we all just gravitated to it. And it's been a great choice for us.
Okay, hey, Michael, over here in Eagle, Idaho, Horseshoe Bend, Idaho. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for a great presentation.
Thanks, Mike.
I kind of waited until the questions settled down because I wanted to ask you a question. It's a little off subject. I am curious what your take is on 3 Yankee 0 Juliet.
My take is it's a very ambitious undertaking. It probably costs them a lot of money. Oh, by the way, on our trips, we always self-fund. We never ask for donations. But then again, we're not chartering boats to go across some godforsaken place. And I didn't get involved with that operation. I worked Bouvet on a couple of bands many decades ago, so I did not get into the fray. At home, I've just got some low dipoles, so I probably wouldn't make it through anyway. So I understand there was a lot of bad behavior interfering with the operation, but also that they made thousands and thousands of contacts. So other than that, I have no comment.
I'm mostly curious about the logistics, having pulled things down a couple of weeks earlier than they expected, and the difficulty and challenge. Do you have any?
Well, yeah, I mean, first they
perspective
had
on
to
that?
get things off the boat and onto the island. And I mean, this is not like you've got a wharf, you know, waiting there to pull up to and hand things off on the dock. I mean, they had to, as far as I know, they either use helicopters or Zodiacs to move things, including heavy stuff like generators. So that's pretty cumbersome at best. They may have had to carry it up some slopes, which is tiring. And they probably had some significant ecological restrictions in order to be able to visit the island. This is true of a lot of relatively uninhabited places where there's, you know, maybe sensitive game or plants or something. So, you know, in some of these places, they have to sterilize everything before they put it on the ship. And there are people much better suited to talk about those logistics. Again, for us, if we can carry it or pack it, we do that. And we try to pick equipment that will stand the trip and not overburden us either at the airports or overburden our wallets when we're checking them in. We've never had to bring power sources, generators. The closest we got, as I said earlier, was bringing lots and lots of Romex so that we could rewire HCHER's shack because there was one 220 source and it went from room to room to room. And of course, the guy on the far end with his amplifier probably wouldn't get enough power to run it. So we brought enough to run 6 parallel runs to the house, each for a dedicated transmitter. But we've never had to go beyond that in terms of power.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. How we doing in the chat, Barry?
We're all set.
Hey, anybody else got their hands up or want to? Let's just open it up. Okay, got comments out there?
Something nobody asked yet, but often our ask is, what does it cost to go on something like this? And also, before somebody asks it, I'll answer. What we typically do, everybody's on their own for airfare. I got a pretty good deal in Air France. I mean, his round trip to the other side of the world was like $1,200. Coach, of course, but it was a reasonably comfortable flight. And then we keep track of all our group expenses, that is, things that contribute to the overall operation. That could be somebody pays an extra luggage fee. We buy group meals. In this case, we tip the ladies that provided all the services during the week. The rental on the facility itself for the days we were building, operating, and tearing down. Those that stayed later paid separately. But when I put all that together, in addition to the flight cost, it ran probably not much more than about $1,500 a piece. So, I mean, I know if I take my family off to the East Coast somewhere, we're going to spend several thousand a week when you add up flights and hotels and meals and entry fees and everything else. So this really isn't out of bounds. I mean, we're not having to raise $150,000 to go to one of these things. It's, typically under $2,000. And we can manage that as long as it's not happening every month.
Gene, you got your hand up.
Yes, my question concerns grounding, both electrical and RF. What challenges, if any, did you have with your systems there, whether it be the antennas and or the equipment?
Well, with the antennas, they're not grounded. Again, they're vertical dipoles, which means you imagine a driven element for an antenna, with an insulator in the middle and the coax going to it. You turn it on its side, and then in order to mount it physically, you put another insulator there and another length of piping. You drive the pipe in the ground. So there really is no grounding, if you will, in terms of the antennas. And other than the ground provided by the electrical outlets, we're on sand and stuff, so it almost doesn't. You could pound a stake in the ground. I imagine the conductivity would be negligible unless you're down near the salt water. So we didn't really have to deal with that.
All right, thank you very much.
Right.
I just had issues with sand when I was in the Army, stationed during deployments in the Middle East, where it was just pure sand and just about 3 or 4 taps with a sledgehammer, an 8-foot ground rod went in like no problem whatsoever. Just curious.
Oh yeah. Well, let's see. You can pound the ground rod into the sand. Question is, what happened? What good does it do once it's down there? I mean, this is sort of like Southern California. You're out the field day running a generator. They say, well, technically you should have a ground stake pointed in, but it's dry dirt. What are you going to, what good is it going to do? It's not going to conduct to anything. It's not going to dissipate a lightning strike, but we don't have lightning strikes. So, certainly you follow, when it's a permanent installation, you follow the National Electrical Code, but when you're in another country and you're doing this for the weekend, you don't worry about it. Now, conceivably, we could have improved the interference to computers with a little less effort had we had some sort of like common ground plane that everything was tied to, but we didn't. You can't bring a big sheet of copper and so on along in your suitcase. And we got it all worked out anyway.
No, I understand. Thank you. That's some pretty good tips. Thanks.
Great comments here. Okay, anybody else?
Chemo has his hand up.
Hey, Chemo, go ahead.
Hey, Marty. Well, just as a comparison, my club, Coal Amateur Radio Club, does field day at the beachside every year, just across from Chinaman's Hat and Kaneohe Bay.
Yeah.
And we run 2-element vertical dipole arrays rather than, 2-element Yagis, basically vertical Yagis, and 40-meter half square. Or on the higher bands, we might run even a bobtail curtain, but they're all in a long line. And then if we have sideband and phone, they're separated by 200 or 300 feet.
Right.
Two sets
So
of antennas.
when you say in a line, that means every antenna is kind of in the null of the next antenna.
That's right. It's all
outside
in
the
one
pattern.
plane, all along the beach.
Yep.
Running several hundred feet in each direction. And we used to center feed the vertical dipoles, but now we don't. We haven't been. We feed them from the bottom at the high voltage point, and we use special little small tuner couplers that we built, and about 2-foot square hardware cloth mesh coupling for ground. So that just sits on the ground.
Okay,
That's
now
your-
is this the same stuff that same hardware that Iran WH6R was describing to me?
Yes, probably.
Okay,
A
yeah,
lot
he
of
said
it
they
was
got great
designed
results
by
for that.
Martin Barr, K6MB. And
Right.
who now is on the mainland, of course, under a different call. But
Yeah, I would like to see one of you guys publish some of that, maybe in QST or something, because I haven't seen that used successfully. But from Iran's descriptions, I stopped by to visit him after our operation
we've been
last year.
using it for years. But the difference is that we can bottom feed it, so we don't have to drapes the coax up across extra support. In fact, that extra support just ends up having the second radiator wire to be the reflector or director, so it's more useful that way.
Yeah.
And it's a voltage feed, so it's a little narrower band, but we don't really care. I mean, if we need to go retweak it, we can, or, it's not that important. But that's what we've been running. Now, the coupler boxes that we custom built, we built a bunch of them at one time, and we put the recipe on our KARC Coal Amateur Radio Club site. I'm not sure if it's there now, but it used to be for years.
Oh, good.
But it's not that hard to do. But obviously these type of situations really beg for a saltwater takeoff right next to the water.
Yes,
And if you-
absolutely.
Yeah,
And
if you
by
don't
the
have
way-
that, it's not necessarily the way to go. Even the 40-meter half square, I mean, it does much better by the water. So,
Yeah,
but
so
it
having
works
salt
well.
water nearby is a great performance enhancer. And those vertical dipoles, they really only work if they are within about a quarter wave of the salt water.
Yeah.
But when I built mine, I put on the rear one, I put a little switch so that I could flick a length in and out, and we could make it a reflector or a director, depending on which way we wanted. But of course, when you saw from that great circle map, everything we wanted was in the northern 180 degrees, which is kind of what those vertical dipoles do.
Well, anyway, so I just wanted to say that there are some other alternatives and different ways of doing it. It's not necessarily for everyone. Obviously, it's some more pieces of equipment. So if you're really trying to travel light, give and take there. Give and take.
That's excellent. Excellent. Thanks, Kimo.
Yeah, you're welcome. Take care. Thanks
You
for the
too.
great presentation.
Thanks. Mahalo.
Well, I found another exit source for a ground. I took a job in Salt Lake City with Eastman Kodak several years ago, and the house I chose to live in was almost on top of Kennecott copper mine.
Oh,
And when I had no idea that this was going on, but I tell you, that's a heck of a ground. I was hearing things with my small vertical that a big gun a couple miles from me couldn't hear with the tons of beams.
Yep. There's another really great hot spot in the West is up near Sacramento, near Davis, UC Davis. They've got wonderful ground there. I know one of my UCLA Radio Club buddies ended up going up there, and he said, everything performed better than down in the hard pan of Southern California.
Yes. It's amazing what a ground will do.
Yes, it is. And if you go and look at some of the literature that LB Sebic did, W4RNL, also a silent key, but he did a lot of writing for QST and other publications, and has a whole compendium of his articles. And he looks at the effect of, when he did a lot of modeling of like NVIS antennas and so on, and just the ground without enhancement in most cases resulted in much poorer performance than either a highly conductive ground or one that you make conductive by putting like a mesh, like a 1x1 wavelength mesh underneath it. So it definitely makes a difference.
Yes.
Anybody else? I guess that's it.
Great, super presentation.
Okay, well, thank you guys. And,
Very educational.
thank
Wait
you
a minute.
for thank you for
George
spending
is-
time. Well, every one of these trips is educational for us, and things I learned there I can use somewhere else. So
Yes.
that's
Thank you for
part of the
sharing.
fun.
Thank you for sharing.
All right.
Well, looks like we're gonna have to wake Dan up.
Just resting his eyes.
Just resting his eyeballs.
I
huh?
saw him breathing.
Oh. All right, folks. Barry, how you doing?
Everything is good.
All right. Well, I want to pull the plug, say 73s, and we'll see you tomorrow.
All right,
Good
thank
night,
you
all.
all.
Thank you for coming.
Have a good
Hey,
evening.
great presentation. Thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.